When the CEO was refused service at her own bank, the manager was instantly fired. Evelyn Reed, a woman who'd built a banking empire on principles of fairness, decided to test her own creation. She wasn't visiting Heartland Financial as its founder, but as an anonymous customer, just another retiree making a deposit. What she encountered, however, was anything but routine. A seemingly simple transaction turned into a tense standoff, fueled by subtle prejudice and a power-hungry branch manager. Evelyn knew the rules of the banking world, but she was about to discover that some rules are made to be broken, especially when they mask a deeper, more insidious problem lurking behind the counter. Evelyn Reed believed in leading by example. That principle had guided her throughout her career, from her early days as a teller to her eventual rise to founder and CEO of Heartland Financial, a regional bank chain with a reputation for integrity and customer service. Now at 62, technically retired but still actively involved as chairwoman of the board, she found herself with more time on her hands, time she often used to make unannounced visits to various Heartland branches. It wasn't about micromanaging, it was about staying connected, seeing firsthand how the values she'd instilled were being upheld, or not. Today's destination was a branch in Springfield, Illinois, a mid-sized city about an hour north of St. Louis. It was a newer branch built just 5 years ago in a growing suburban area. Evelyn had chosen this location deliberately. It was far enough from the corporate headquarters to have its own distinct culture, but close enough for a day trip. She wanted to see how things were operating on the ground, away from the watchful eyes of the executive team. She also wanted to see whether her directives had made it to the front lines. She parked her unassuming sedan in the customer lot, deliberately avoiding the spaces reserved for management. She wasn't here as the CEO, she was here as a customer. She'd even dressed the part, opting for a comfortable pair of slacks, a simple blouse, and a cardigan, instead of her usual tailored business attire. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wore minimal makeup. She wanted to blend in, to be treated like any other retiree coming in to make a transaction. The branch itself was a reflection of Heartland Financial's brand, clean, modern, and welcoming, but without unnecessary extravagance. The walls were painted in calming shades of blue and gray, and large windows let in plenty of natural light. Local artwork adorned the walls, a subtle nod to the community the bank served. It was designed to be efficient, but not sterile, professional, but not intimidating. It was the kind of place where, in theory, anyone should feel comfortable walking in, regardless of their background or their financial status. As she entered, the automatic doors slid open with a quiet whoosh, and she was greeted by the familiar hum of a busy bank, the clicking of keyboards, the whirring of cash counters, the muted conversations between tellers and customers. It was a weekday afternoon, not overly crowded, but with a steady flow of activity. She noticed a few customers in line, a couple sitting at desks talking to loan officers, and a security guard standing near the entrance, observing the scene with a practiced eye. So far, so good. Everything seemed to be operating smoothly. Evelyn joined the short line for the tellers, her eyes scanning the room, taking in the details. She noticed the tellers' uniforms, crisp white shirts and navy blue blazers, with name tags clearly displayed. She noticed the signage, promoting various bank services and community initiatives. She noticed the overall atmosphere, which seemed professional and courteous, but also a bit impersonal. There was a lack of genuine warmth, a sense of going through the motions. When she reached the counter, the young teller, a woman named Amy according to her name tag, barely looked up. "Next," she said, her voice flat, her eyes fixed on her computer screen. Evelyn stepped forward. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice pleasant and clear. "I'd like to deposit a check, please." Amy finally looked up, her expression neutral, almost bored. She reached for a deposit slip without a word, sliding it across the counter. Evelyn took the slip and filled it out, carefully writing in her account number and the amount of the check. $6,000. It was a legitimate payment, a consulting fee from a small business she'd advised, a way to keep her mind sharp and her skills relevant during her retirement. It wasn't an unusually large amount, but it was significant enough to require a signature and ID verification, standard procedure for any bank. She handed the completed slip and the endorsed check to Amy, along with her driver's license. She expected a quick, efficient transaction, the kind she'd always strived to provide to Heartland Financial customers. But that's not what happened. Amy took the check and the ID, her eyes flicking over them briefly. Then she hesitated. She looked at the check again, then at Evelyn, then back at her computer screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she didn't type anything. A subtle frown creased her forehead. "Is there a problem?" Evelyn asked, her voice still calm, but with a hint of concern. Amy didn't answer immediately. She picked up Evelyn's driver's license, studying it more closely, as if searching for some hidden flaw. Then she glanced towards the back of the branch, where a man in a suit was standing, observing the tellers. He was the branch manager. His name tag said, Mark Jensen. "Just a moment," Amy said finally, her voice tight. She turned and walked towards Mark Jensen, holding Evelyn's check and ID. Evelyn watched them, her unease growing. This wasn't standard procedure. This wasn't the way Heartland Financial was supposed to operate. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the air, in the sudden shift in atmosphere, in the way Amy and Mark were avoiding her gaze. She had a sinking feeling that this simple transaction was about to become something much more complicated, and she had a strong suspicion that it had nothing to do with the check itself. It had to do with her. Mark Jensen, the branch manager, approached the counter with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was a man in his early 40s, with a neatly trimmed haircut and a suit that looked a size too small, giving him a slightly constricted appearance. He exuded an air of self-importance, the kind that often came with a little bit of authority and a lot of insecurity. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice smooth but lacking genuine warmth. "I'm Mark Jensen, the branch manager. Is there a problem?" "I was simply trying to deposit a check," Evelyn replied, her voice calm and even. She gestured towards the counter, where her endorsed check and driver's license still lay. "But apparently there's some sort of issue." Jensen picked up her license, examining it with an exaggerated level of scrutiny. He looked at the picture, then at Evelyn, then back at the picture, as if trying to find some discrepancy. It was a subtle but unmistakable gesture of distrust. "And this is your current address?" he asked, pointing to the address on the license. "Yes," Evelyn replied, her patience starting to wear thin. "I've lived at that address for over 20 years. I've been a customer of this bank and this branch for a long time." She emphasized "this branch," hoping to jog his memory, or at least trigger some recognition of a long-standing customer. Jensen ignored the emphasis. "And this check," he said, picking it up and holding it as if it were contaminated, "it's for $6,000. Can you tell me the source of these funds?" Evelyn felt a flicker of anger, but she kept her voice level. "It's a consulting fee," she said. "I do some occasional work for small businesses." She didn't elaborate, feeling it was none of his business. "Consulting?" Jensen repeated, his tone skeptical. "And what kind of consulting would that be, ma'am?" Evelyn stared at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. This was beyond routine questioning. This was an interrogation, and it was based on nothing more than her appearance and the amount of the check. She could feel the subtle but unmistakable weight of prejudice, the assumption that she, a black woman of a certain age, couldn't possibly have earned that money legitimately. "Mr. Jensen," she said, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge, "I've provided you with my identification, a valid check, and my account number. I've answered your questions. What is the problem?" Jensen's smile tightened. "We have procedures, ma'am," he said. "We need to verify the legitimacy of all large transactions. It's for your protection as well as the bank's." $6,000 is hardly a large transaction for this bank, Evelyn countered. "And I've been a customer here for years. You have my entire financial history on file." She gestured towards the computer screen behind the counter. "You can see my account balance, my deposit history, my credit rating. You can see that I'm a low-risk customer, so I'll ask you again, what is the real problem?" Jensen shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting towards Amy, the teller, who was watching the exchange with a mixture of nervousness and apprehension. He clearly wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a customer. "We just need to verify the source of the funds, ma'am," he repeated, his voice losing some of its smoothness. "It's standard procedure." "Standard procedure for whom, Mr. Jensen?" Evelyn asked, her voice now laced with steel. "Do you ask every customer who deposits a check of this amount to provide a detailed explanation of their income? Do you scrutinize their IDs with this level of intensity? Or is it just me?" She could see the other customers in the bank starting to take notice. A few were whispering amongst themselves, glancing in her direction. The security guard, Mr. Davis, who had been standing near the entrance, took a step closer, his hand hovering near his belt. The atmosphere in the bank had shifted from routine to tense, from impersonal to overtly hostile. "Ma'am, there's no need to be confrontational," Jensen said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. "We're just trying to follow protocol." "Protocol?" Evelyn repeated, her voice rising slightly. "Or prejudice. Because that's what this feels like, Mr. Jensen. It feels like you've looked at me, made some assumptions based on my appearance, and decided that I don't belong here, that I couldn't possibly have earned this money legitimately." Jensen's face flushed red. He opened his mouth to protest, but Evelyn cut him off. "I've been a customer of this bank for longer than you've probably been working here," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "I know the policies, I know the procedures, and I know when someone is treating me differently because of the color of my skin." The silence in the bank was now complete. Every eye was on them, every ear straining to hear the exchange. Amy, the teller, looked pale and shaken. Mr. Davis, the security guard, stood frozen, unsure of how to react. "Ma'am, I assure you that's not the case," Jensen stammered, his voice losing all of its earlier confidence. "We treat all our customers equally." "Then prove it," Evelyn challenged. "Deposit my check, process my transaction, like you would for any other customer." Jensen hesitated. He looked at the check, then at Evelyn, then at the security guard, his eyes darting back and forth, searching for an escape. He was trapped, caught between his own prejudice and the undeniable logic of Evelyn's words. He knew he'd gone too far, that he'd made a mistake. But he was too proud, too stubborn, to admit it. I can't do that, ma'am," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "I need to verify the check with the issuing bank. It's standard procedure for large deposits." "Then call them," Evelyn said, her voice unwavering. "Call them right now, in front of me, and let's see what they say." She knew he wouldn't. She knew it was a bluff, a last-ditch attempt to save face. And she was about to call him on it. The tension in the room was palpable, a thick, suffocating blanket of unspoken accusations and simmering anger. The simple transaction had become a battleground, a test of wills, a stark demonstration of the insidious nature of prejudice. Evelyn stood firm, her gaze unwavering, fixed on Mark Jensen. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the hum of the bank's air conditioning and the muffled whispers of the other customers. She knew this was a pivotal moment. She could back down, accept his flimsy excuse, and walk away, leaving the injustice unchallenged. Or she could fight back, using the knowledge and experience she'd gained over a lifetime to expose his prejudice and hold him accountable. She chose the latter. "Mr. Jensen," she said, her voice calm but firm, "you and I both know that's not standard procedure. For a check of this amount, drawn on a reputable bank from a long-standing customer with a spotless record, you don't need to call the issuing bank. You can verify it electronically, right here, right now. You have the tools and you have the authority. You're choosing not to." Jensen shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. "Ma'am, I'm just following protocol." "Show me the protocol," Evelyn interrupted, her voice sharper now. "Show me the written policy that states you must call the issuing bank for a check of this amount from a customer with my history. Show it to me in writing." Jensen and Amy exchanged a quick, nervous glance. Amy, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, shuffled her feet and avoided eye contact. Jensen, however, was starting to look flustered. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, realizing he was trapped. I don't have it here at the counter," he stammered. It's in the back office." "Then get it," Evelyn said, her voice unwavering. "I'll wait." She crossed her arms, her posture relaxed but resolute. She wasn't going anywhere. She wasn't going to be intimidated. She wasn't going to be dismissed. She was going to stand her ground, and she was going to make him explain himself. Jensen hesitated for a moment longer, then, with a sigh of resignation, turned and disappeared into the back office. Evelyn watched him go, her mind racing. She knew he was stalling, trying to buy time, hoping she would give up and leave. But she wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. While he was gone, she took out her phone, pretending to check her messages, but actually starting a voice recording. She wanted to document everything, to have a record of this encounter, in case she needed it later. She also subtly shifted her position, making sure she was visible to the other customers in the bank, letting them know, without saying a word, that she wasn't going to be a silent victim. She noticed the security guard, Mr. Davis, watching her, his expression unreadable. She met his gaze, holding it for a moment, a silent communication passing between them. She wasn't a threat, she was a customer, being treated unfairly, and she wasn't going to back down. She also used this time to pull out a small, well-worn notebook and a pen from her purse. She flipped to a clean page and began to jot down notes, documenting the timeline of events, the specific questions Jensen had asked, his demeanor, Amy's reactions, the presence of the security guard. She wrote in a clear, concise hand, using the precise language of a seasoned professional. This wasn't just a personal grievance. It was a potential legal case, and she was going to treat it as such. She remembered her training. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only 5 minutes, Jensen returned, empty-handed. He avoided Evelyn's gaze, his face flushed. I couldn't find the specific policy," he mumbled. "But I assure you, ma'am, it's standard procedure." "Standard procedure to discriminate against your customers, Mr. Jensen?" Evelyn interrupted, her voice cutting through his excuses. "Standard procedure to make assumptions based on appearance? Standard procedure to treat a long-standing customer with suspicion and disrespect?" Jensen flinched, his carefully constructed facade of professionalism crumbling. He opened his mouth to protest, but Evelyn continued, her voice rising slightly, but still controlled. "I know my rights, Mr. Jensen," she said, "and I know banking regulations. You're violating several of them right now. You're refusing to process a legitimate transaction without just cause. You're treating me differently than other customers, and you're doing it because you think you can get away with it." She paused, letting her words sink in. Then she delivered the next blow. "I also know," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, but still audible to everyone in the bank, "that this branch has had issues in the past. Issues with customer service, issues with compliance, issues with fair treatment. Issues that were brought to the attention of the regional manager, Mr. Thompson. I wonder what he would think of this situation." She let the name hang in the air, a subtle but powerful weapon. She knew, from her years in the banking industry, that mentioning the regional manager, especially by name, would get their attention. It was a signal that she wasn't just some random customer. She was someone who knew how the system worked, someone who had connections. Jensen's eyes widened slightly. He clearly recognized the name. He knew that Mr. Thompson was a stickler for rules, a champion of customer service, and a man who wouldn't tolerate discrimination of any kind. Amy, the teller, looked increasingly uncomfortable, her gaze darting between Jensen and Evelyn. She was starting to realize that she was caught in the middle of something much bigger than she'd anticipated. She was young, inexperienced, and she'd been following her manager's lead, trusting his judgment. But now she was beginning to doubt that judgment, to see the cracks in his facade. "Mr. Jensen," Evelyn said, her voice softening slightly, "I'm going to give you one more chance. Deposit my check, treat me with the respect I deserve, and let's put this behind us." She knew she was taking a risk. She could have revealed her identity right then and there, ended the charade, and asserted her authority. But she wanted to see if he would do the right thing, if he would recognize his mistake and correct it. She wanted to give him a chance to redeem himself. She wanted to see if the values she'd instilled in Heartland Financial were still alive, even in this small, seemingly insignificant branch. Jensen hesitated, his eyes flickering between Evelyn, the check, and the security guard. He was weighing his options, calculating the risks. He could continue to stonewall her, to try to save face, to hope that she would eventually give up and go away. Or he could admit his mistake, apologize, and process the transaction. He knew that the latter was the right thing to do, but his pride, his prejudice, his fear of losing control were holding him back. The entire branch was hushed. The silence stretched, becoming almost unbearable. Then finally Jensen let out a sigh, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Okay, ma'am," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I'll deposit the check." It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was a concession. It was an admission of defeat. It was a start. Evelyn nodded, her expression still firm but with a hint of satisfaction. She had won this round. But she knew the fight wasn't over. This wasn't just about a single transaction. It was about a systemic problem, a culture of bias that needed to be addressed. And she was determined to see it through. She handed her phone to Amy. "I want to keep recording," Evelyn instructed Amy. "I'll need your name, Mr. Jensen's, and Mr. Davis's names in writing. I want a written record of this interaction. I want a full explanation, in writing, of why my perfectly legitimate check was almost refused." Evelyn knew this would make everyone very uncomfortable, but it also ensured a level of accountability that she couldn't otherwise rely on. It also meant that she would leave with more than just a deposited check. She would have the beginning of a case. Amy, visibly flustered, took the phone with trembling hands, making sure the recording continued. She fumbled with the keyboard, processing the deposit with uncharacteristic speed. The tension in the bank was palpable. Every customer, every employee, was acutely aware of the drama unfolding. Mr. Jensen, meanwhile, stood stiffly, his face a mask of forced politeness, trying desperately to regain control of the situation. "Of course, ma'am," he said, his voice strained. "We'll provide you with a full written explanation. We apologize for any inconvenience." But Evelyn wasn't going to let him off that easily. "Inconvenience, Mr. Jensen?" she repeated, her voice laced with irony. "Is that what you call it? Being treated like a criminal in my own bank? Being subjected to baseless suspicion and discriminatory treatment? That's more than an inconvenience, Mr. Jensen. It's an insult." She turned to Mr. Davis, the security guard, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. "Mr. Davis," she said, her voice firm but respectful, "I understand you were just following Mr. Jensen's instructions, but I hope you realize that you were complicit in this discriminatory behavior. You were called over here to intimidate me, to make me feel unwelcome, to make me feel like I didn't belong, and that's unacceptable." Mr. Davis shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Ma'am, he began, but Evelyn cut him off. "I expect better from Heartland Financial," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "I expect better from all of you." She turned back to Mr. Jensen, who was now visibly sweating. He had clearly underestimated her, and he was starting to realize the gravity of his mistake. He had no idea who she really was, but he knew he was in trouble. "Now, Mr. Jensen," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, but still audible to everyone in the bank, "I believe you owe me a proper apology. And then, I want you to explain to me and to everyone else in this room why you treated me this way. Why you singled me out, why you assumed I was a criminal." Jensen hesitated, his eyes darting around the room, desperately searching for an escape. But there was none. He was cornered, exposed, his prejudice laid bare for all to see. He stammered, his voice cracking. "I was just following procedure." "Procedure?" Evelyn repeated, her voice sharp. "Show me the procedure that allows you to discriminate against customers based on their appearance. Show me the procedure that allows you to treat a long-standing customer with suspicion and disrespect. Show me the procedure that allows you to call security on a woman who is simply trying to deposit a check." Jensen couldn't answer. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was drowning in his own prejudice, his own incompetence, his own arrogance. Evelyn took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "Mr. Jensen," she said, her voice low and steady, "I think it's time you learned a lesson. A lesson about respect, about fairness, about treating all customers equally, regardless of their race, their age, or their appearance. She paused, letting her words sink in. Then, she delivered the final blow. "You see, Mr. Jensen," she said, her voice taking on a new authority, "I'm not just any customer. I'm Evelyn Reed, and I founded Heartland Financial." The silence in the bank was deafening. Every eye was fixed on Evelyn, on Jensen, on the unfolding drama. Amy gasped, dropping the pen she was holding. Mr. Davis straightened up, his expression shifting from confusion to shock. The other customers murmured amongst themselves, their whispers a mixture of surprise and disbelief. Jensen's face drained of all color. He looked like he'd been struck by lightning. He stared at Evelyn, his mouth agape, his eyes wide with disbelief. He finally understood. He had just discriminated against, humiliated, and attempted to intimidate the very woman who had built the institution he worked for. You're, he stammered, unable to complete the sentence. "Yes, Mr. Jensen," Evelyn said, her voice calm but firm. "I am, and I can assure you this little incident will be thoroughly investigated." She turned to Amy, her expression softening slightly. "Young lady," she said, "I hope you learn from this. Don't let fear or prejudice guide your actions. Treat every customer with respect, regardless of how they look or how much money they have in their account. That's what Heartland Financial is supposed to be about." Amy nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "Yes, ma'am," she whispered. I'm so sorry." Evelyn then turned to Mr. Davis. "And you, sir," she said, "need to remember that your job is to protect all customers, not just the ones the manager deems worthy." Mr. Davis nodded, his expression contrite. "Yes, ma'am, I understand." Evelyn then turned back to face the entire lobby. "I built this bank on the principles of fairness, accessibility, and respect," she announced, her voice strong and clear, "and I will not tolerate discrimination of any kind within its walls." She paused, letting her words resonate with the assembled customers and employees. "I expect better, and I demand better. From now on, things are going to change. This branch and every branch of Heartland Financial will be a place where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. That's my promise to you." With that, she turned and walked towards the exit, her head held high, her back straight. The customers parted to let her pass, their eyes filled with admiration and gratitude. She had not only stood up for herself, she had stood up for all of them. As she stepped out of the bank and into the afternoon sunlight, she felt a sense of satisfaction, but also a sense of sadness. She was glad that she had been able to expose the prejudice and incompetence within her own company, but she was also deeply disappointed that it had existed in the first place. She knew that the fight for equality was far from over, but she was determined to do her part, to make sure that Heartland Financial lived up to its name, to its values, to its promise. The simple transaction had become a powerful lesson, a reminder that vigilance and courage were always necessary, even in the places we least expect them. Evelyn Reed didn't waste any time. Within an hour of leaving the Springfield branch of Heartland Financial, she was on the phone with the bank's CEO, Robert Chen, a man she had personally mentored and handpicked as her successor. She recounted the incident in detail, her voice calm but firm, conveying the gravity of the situation without resorting to hyperbole. She emphasized not just the personal insult, but the systemic implications of Mark Jensen's behavior. Robert Chen listened intently, his initial shock quickly giving way to anger and then to a steely resolve. He had known Evelyn for years, respected her judgment implicitly, and understood that she wouldn't make such accusations lightly. He also knew that this incident, if not handled swiftly and decisively, could severely damage Heartland Financial's reputation and erode customer trust. "Evelyn," he said, his voice grave, "I'm appalled. This is completely unacceptable. I promise you, I'll take immediate action." And he did. Within 24 hours, Mark Jensen was fired. His termination was swift and unequivocal, a clear message to all Heartland Financial employees that discriminatory behavior would not be tolerated. Amy, the teller, was placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation and mandatory retraining. Mr. Davis, the security guard, received a formal reprimand and was reassigned to a different branch. But Robert Chen, at Evelyn's urging, didn't stop there. He understood that this wasn't just about punishing individual bad actors. It was about addressing the underlying culture that had allowed such behavior to fester. He launched a company-wide review of customer service policies and procedures, with a particular focus on identifying and eliminating any potential biases in the system. He commissioned an independent audit of all Heartland Financial branches, looking for patterns of discriminatory treatment, excessive scrutiny of minority customers, and any other irregularities. He knew this would be a costly and time-consuming undertaking, but he also knew it was necessary. He needed to send a clear message, both internally and externally, that Heartland Financial was committed to fairness and equality. He also mandated comprehensive diversity and inclusion training for all employees, from the tellers on the front lines to the executives in the corporate offices. This training wasn't just a perfunctory exercise. It was a deep dive into unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity, and the importance of treating all customers with respect and dignity. It was designed to challenge assumptions, to promote empathy, and to create a more inclusive and welcoming environment for everyone. Furthermore, Robert Chen established a new anonymous reporting system, a confidential hotline and online portal, where both customers and employees could report instances of discrimination or unfair treatment without fear of retaliation. He made it clear that all complaints would be taken seriously, investigated thoroughly, and addressed promptly. He wanted to create a culture of transparency and accountability, where everyone felt empowered to speak up and challenge wrongdoing. He understood it would take time. Evelyn, though officially retired, remained actively involved in these reforms. She shared her own experience, not as a victim, but as a leader determined to learn from the past and build a better future. She participated in training sessions, offering her insights and perspectives, reminding employees of the core values upon which Heartland Financial had been founded. She emphasized that fairness and equality weren't just buzzwords, they were fundamental principles that had to be reflected in every interaction, every transaction, every decision. The changes implemented at Heartland Financial had a ripple effect throughout the community. The Springfield Gazette, alerted to the situation by Evelyn's recording, and a well-placed anonymous tip, ran a front-page story about the incident, highlighting Evelyn's courage and the bank's swift response. The story sparked a broader conversation about racial bias in customer service, prompting other businesses in the area to review their own policies and practices. The Springfield branch of Heartland Financial, once a symbol of discrimination and mistrust, became a model of inclusivity and respect. The new branch manager, a woman of color with a long and distinguished career in banking, was carefully selected for her commitment to fairness and her ability to build strong relationships with the community. The staff, shaken by the events and the subsequent reforms, underwent intensive retraining, emerging with a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of their responsibilities. Customers, initially wary, gradually returned, reassured by the visible changes and the bank's commitment to doing better. They saw a more diverse staff, a more welcoming atmosphere, and a genuine effort to treat everyone with dignity and respect. The incident, though painful, had ultimately served as a catalyst for positive change, transforming the branch into a stronger, more inclusive institution. Several weeks after the incident, Evelyn returned to the Springfield branch, this time not incognito, but as a guest speaker at a staff meeting. She shared her story, her vision for Heartland Financial, and her unwavering belief in the power of fairness and equality. She reminded them that every customer interaction was an opportunity to build trust, to strengthen relationships, and to uphold the values of the company. She spoke not with anger or resentment, but with a quiet determination, a deep-seated commitment to making a difference. She had seen the worst of human behavior, but she had also seen the best, the willingness of people to learn, to grow, to change. And she knew that the fight for justice was a long and ongoing process, but one that was always worth fighting. The bank was better. As she looked around the room, at the faces of the tellers, the loan officers, the managers, she saw a renewed sense of purpose, a shared commitment to building a better future. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that there would be challenges and setbacks. But she also knew that Heartland Financial and the community it served were stronger, more resilient, and more just because of what had happened. The simple transaction had become a catalyst for profound and lasting change, and that, she realized, was the best kind of legacy she could leave behind. This story reminds us that age and experience are invaluable assets, not limitations. Like Evelyn Reed, we may encounter situations where we are underestimated or treated unfairly. In those moments, remember the power of calm strength, clear communication, and knowing your rights. Don't be afraid to challenge injustice, even if it means confronting those in authority. Your years have given you wisdom and resilience. Use them. Remember, too, that true respect is earned, not demanded, and that building a legacy of fairness requires constant vigilance and a willingness to speak truth to power, even within the institutions we helped create.